Hi everyone. Today we'll continue to go through our final book of the semester, The Rich Get Richer, The Poor Get Prison. In doing so, we're looking at the institution of the criminal justice system in reference to social class. So before we get into our main topic for today's presentation, looking at white-collar crime and how white-collar criminals often perform criminal activities, but the activities go unseen and untreated as such. And again, that ties into one of the book report questions. So, kind of at the top of the book report, you'll be getting into this topic for today. But before we move into that, just a brief recap of what we're doing. We're looking at the main argument from the authors being that how the criminal justice system is organized. Its organization advantages the wealthy. It provides privileges to those who have wealth, who have money, and it disadvantages those who do not. So it works against people who lack money, who lack wealth. So again, most people would hope when you encounter the criminal justice system at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end, that all people would be treated equally based upon kind of what they did rather than who they are in terms of their age, in terms of their sex, in terms of their race, or in terms of their class. But here the argument is variables do matter, and one key variable in terms of how you experience the criminal justice system is the variable of one's social class background. So that's the main argument. And then we talk about a subthesis. So a secondary main argument that you see being put forth throughout the book is that, again, how the criminal justice system is organized. Its organization operates to reproduce crime, so keep the crime rate consistent more or less, rather than reducing it, rather than actually decreasing crime. So like I mentioned last class presentation, perhaps we'd be okay with the class bias if the system actually worked to deter, to decrease crime. But in actuality, in addition to being a flawed system, because it advantages some people and disadvantages others, the system doesn't work in terms of reducing, deterring crime itself. So as an institution, the authors are not trying to critique the people in the system, saying that they're not doing their job, because they are. They're doing their job as they're supposed to be doing it. So the judges and lawyers are playing by the rules. The prison officials, the police officers are playing by the rules. And so it's not the people playing the game, it's the rules of the game that need to be changed if we want to eliminate the bias, if we want to eliminate how it operates to reproduce crime rather than reducing it. Today's presentation, we're going to focus on the reading in reference to the first part of the book report. So some of what we'll get into in our next class presentation is what you read for today's class period, but we'll leave that conversation for the next class presentation when we'll talk about the second and third parts of your book report. So focusing on the first part of the report today, we're looking at how people perform white-collar crime, but their crimes go unseen and untreated as such. So here we see one angle in which the wealthy are advantaged when it comes to the criminal justice system. When they are performing criminal activities, typically those activities are marginalized. People don't think that they're important to focus on. Rather, people want to focus on the criminal activities being done by blue-collar criminals, being done by those from the working and lower classes. So getting into this conversation, we can say that when we look at how we define crime, and how we define criminals, and then compare that to how we think about crime, how we think about criminals. So looking at defining crime, criminals versus ideas of crime and criminals, we can say that we define crime as unlawful activities that are harmful for society. So here we're looking at something that's unlawful, it's against the law, but also we tend to think about it, or we tend to define it as something that is harmful for society. So we can look at jaywalking as an example, or maybe speeding just a few miles per hour over the limit. Yes, they're unlawful activities, but we don't think of them necessarily as crime because they're not that harmful for society as a whole. And so when we define crime, typically we're thinking of things that are against the law and that are harmful for society at large. Thus, when we think of criminals, we define them as people who commit these acts, people who commit unlawful activities that are harmful for society. Now, our ideas of crime and our ideas of criminals are more specific. When we think of crime in terms of an idea, what pops into our head, what comes to mind is the blue collar criminal activity, kind of the person crimes, whether it be a robbery, whether it be some type of violent activity, physical altercation, domestic violence. So typically that's what comes to mind, whether it be how we think about it, what we read about, what we see on the television. We see and we think about kind of the person, blue collar criminal activity. Thus, when we think of criminals, what comes to mind, what we usually see in the media, is that blue collar, lower class criminal. So we can look at the definitions versus the ideas of crime and criminals and say there's a mismatch here. And this mismatch creates a blind spot, something that we don't see, something that really doesn't come to our mind, something we don't pay any attention to. And basically, what I'm talking about here, when there's this mismatch between the ideas of crime and how we define it, we tend to turn a blind eye to white collar crime and white collar criminals. By definition, white collar crime kind of fits in terms of white collar crime represents unlawful activities that are harmful for society at large. And white collar criminals are those people who commit these activities that are harmful for society at large. So it fits the definition, white collar crime, white collar criminal, but it doesn't fit our ideas. So we don't think of white collar criminal activities when we stereotypically, think of criminal activities. You're more likely to think of a robbery. You're more likely to think of a murder compared to embezzlement, compared to somebody who dies because an automobile company doesn't want to recall their cars because it'll cost them too much to recall the automobile and to fix the problem in the car to make it safe for the consumer. So again, the white collar criminal is somebody who is committing harm for society at large, but the white collar criminal doesn't kind of fit the stereotypical criminal. We don't think of the kind of wealthy individual at the top of a business, or we don't think of the doctor, prescribing drugs to a patient. We don't think about the people manufacturing, the food that we eat, the liquids that we're drinking as criminal. And so they don't really come to mind in terms of when we actually think about crime and criminal activity. So, as I say, in other words, white collar crime, as you read for today, as we'll discuss in the next slide, is harmful for society. It reaches, from anywhere to thousands to millions of people on a yearly basis. And the white collar criminals, so the people behind the crime, whether it be directly, indirectly, are causing physical damage, economic damage, and emotional damage to many people. And so, again, this fits the definition of crime. You're doing something harmful that reaches a lot of people, but it doesn't really match our ideas of crime in terms of how we stereotypically think about what crime is and who criminals are. And this mismatch between how we define, how we think about crime operates to incorrectly minimize the impact and the overall amount of white collar criminal activity. Continuing to look at how white collar crime often goes unseen and untreated as such, we can break down white collar crime into three general categories. Categories in which we can see unlawful activities, activities that reach a large amount of individuals. And so, again, you see something that has a large influence on people, it touches a lot of people number wise, and in terms of a kind of quality wise, a quality, we see that it does inflict harm on people. And we'll get into that further. And overall, again, it's something unlawful. So you're breaking a law when it comes to unfair business practices. You're breaking a law when it comes to some type of negligence in terms of medicine, and you're breaking different laws when it comes to what you're doing in terms of putting in food or producing into the environment. So again, everything kind of fits the definition in terms of it's unlawful and it reaches a lot of people, but it doesn't fit sometimes how we think of crime, ideas of it, because the people tend to be wealthier individuals that don't stereotypically look and perhaps live like the blue collar criminal we're more likely to see, more likely to think of. And we typically don't read or hear about these activities. And as a result, we don't think that they're out there as much. We underestimate the number of white collar crimes that go on. And then we again underestimate how harmful these crimes can be for society as a whole. So we say that not only are these crimes going on, but these crimes go on unrecognized. We can also say that the wealthy can profit, they can save money with these unlawful activities. So here again, the rich get richer part of the argument, the upper class, the wealthy being advantaged in the criminal justice system becomes twofold. You're advantaged in the sense that a lot of your crime goes unseen, not a lot of attention by the criminal justice system is on white collar crime, so you're more likely to get away with it if nobody's really paying attention to it. And then on top of that, these activities that you are performing that are often ignored, marginalized in favor of the blue collar crime, these activities typically are making you money, whether it be you're making higher profits off of the activities or you're actually saving money through the activities. So one category we can look at the category of workplace activities. So again, unlawful activities that go on within the workplace, representing different forms of white collar crime. Again, it's a short list here. The chapter does a good job of kind of showing us the different types of white collar crime and the different percentages and numbers around those types. So make sure to focus on all that when you're writing your paper. But generally speaking, we can talk about tax evasion, we can talk about embezzlement, injuries, deaths, different types of illnesses that connect to the workplace. And again, we're not talking about something that happens by chance. So things happen at work sometimes, and people will get injured, or perhaps get sick. If a coworker comes in sick, you could get sick. We're not talking about those things. We're talking about a sickness due to a place of work not keeping up their kind of work codes in terms of their environment they're providing their workers. We're talking about injuries and deaths that occur on the job due to not going up to standards of safety regulations. So again, we're not talking about just bad luck. We're talking about things that are unlawful because you're not, up to date with your regulations. You're not following the codes as prescribed to you by law. And so here, we'll again look at how the numbers show us that these things impact people by the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, depending on what you're looking at. And not only are we looking at the victim being victimized in terms of poor health results, you get sick, you get injured, perhaps you even die. But also, we're talking about people losing their jobs. So you get injured, you get sick at work. Perhaps you're going to lose your job as a whole. We're talking about people losing out money when tax evasions by large companies, embezzlement occurs. Typically, people can lose savings. People perhaps lose their job as a result of this. Not because you did the tax evasion or you did the embezzlement, but when a company loses a lot of this money through the tax evasion and through the embezzlement, then they have to look for certain places to try to make up that loss. And typically it's passed on to the consumer, where you're going to charge the consumer more for your products, higher fees, higher prices for your services, or perhaps you pass it on to your workers, or you make your workers take pay cuts, or you lay off workers to save money. So again, it happens to a lot of people, and the impacts are there, and the consequences are negative consequences in terms of losing out on jobs, losing out on money, encountering the injuries, poor health, and perhaps even death. So now we can look at the second category, healthcare activities, and we'll talk about the thousands, tens of thousands of healthcare activities that occur on a yearly basis that fall into the white collar crime. Again, we can go even higher by looking at the malpractice, just a general medical negligence that goes on, where you're performing kind of poor surgeries and doing more harm than good to the patient. And then again, usually this gets chalked up to it was an accident. The doctor, the surgeon, he wasn't trying to inflict harm. But again, typically it's not seen in the same way if a regular person was perhaps, driving their car and accidentally, hit somebody, whether it be somebody driving another car or somebody, walking or riding a bike. That's going to be kind of seen as a crime, kind of a direct crime, where the malpractice, the medical negligence, also doing harm, like hitting somebody with a car, it kind of goes unseen and as untreated as such. But again, it can have very long-term consequences for people in terms of their personal health, in terms of the personal finances, having to pay for more medical procedures in the future. And this happens again much more often than we imagine. All we have to do is kind of ask somebody, ask a parent, ask a friend if they've heard of any of these cases. And many people can give you multiple stories, if not personal, kind of indirect stories of these things happening. So we can look at unnecessary surgeries as well. So how, again, on a yearly basis, we're seeing tens of thousands of surgeries that are performed that aren't needed. So, if this person would have gone to maybe a second or third opinion, then they would have been told, no, you don't need this procedure, you don't need such a surgery. and this is illegal. This is against the kind of medical law in terms of you're not supposed to be performing something that doesn't need to be performed. And these unnecessary surgeries can not only make situations worse, but they can create new situations for people in terms of poor health. But also, again, this will create financial situations for people when you're paying for these surgeries that don't matter. And then unnecessary drug prescriptions, again, go on all the time. And the harm can be, you're getting addicted to the medicine, you get addicted to certain prescription drugs, and those addictions can cause, again, money and health issues as well. And, I'll stop here before I move on to 3, just to touch on kind of that common thread of not only are these crimes going on all the time and doing harm to a lot of people, but these crimes are helping the wealthy, whether it be the doctors, the hospitals, the CEOs, the companies, profit, make money and save money. Because every time you perform a surgery that's not needed, every time you write prescriptions and that aren't needed to begin with, or shouldn't go on as long as they do, money is being collected, directly through the consumer, directly through the insurance companies, at the workplace, when you're trying to save money by not updating your buildings, by not updating your automobiles to the needed, mandated safety standards, when you're doing the tax evasion and doing the embezzlement. Again, all of this is motivated to save money or to make money. And I'll jump to the bottom of our slide here. We can say that the common thread, the common motivation is P over P. These companies, they want to make profit over caring for people. And so finally, the same kind of motivation can be seen with the chemical warfare conversation. Here we're looking at different forms of pollution, whether it be in what we eat, what we drink, or the air we breathe. And again, it's this idea is that these companies are trying to perhaps take shortcuts, are trying to perhaps just not follow the guidelines, the rules and regulations as put forth by the law. And in doing so, you're kind of indirectly sometimes putting people at risk when you're putting the pollutants into the air and making people suffer more who have illnesses to begin with, perhaps creating illnesses that did not exist to begin with. When you put it directly into kind of the water we're drinking, the food that we're eating, again, kind of indirectly, you're doing harm to the consumers. And again, the book does a good example of kind of looking at the different statistics and looking at the different examples of cases that go on and that impact a lot of people, and the victims suffer in terms of the illness, the deaths that occur. And sometimes, they get charged, but, usually if they do get in trouble for all 3 of these categories, if they are kind of charged, they rarely serve any jail time. They write a check and kind of get out of it, compared to the blue-collar criminal. They don't get the option of simply writing a check and kind of going on with their day-to-day lives. So overall, again, we can look at each of the categories and see that there are harmful activities going on through white-collar crime that touches on several hundred thousands of victims. And not only the victims, but also we can think about their families. And so, when somebody dies, when somebody gets sick, when somebody loses their job, or when somebody is kind of having to pay more for other people's crimes, financially speaking, then it's not only them, often their family is going to be touched by this as well. And just to kind of touch on this again, the P over P motivation, when you're doing all these things, you're not really thinking about the consequences for people, but more often you're thinking about the consequences in terms of making money and consequences of saving money, the main motivations behind white-collar crime. And again, although we think of criminal activity as blue collar crime, what we just talked about kind of matches our definition of how we really define crime: against the law and harmful for people as a whole.